Tonight we travel back through the centuries to the early summer of the year 1314. Scotland is a very different land from the one we know today. The countryside is vast and quiet. Great forests stretch across the hills. Rivers wind slowly through wide valleys, and small villages sit scattered across the landscape, connected by rough tracks and narrow roads. Most people live simple lives here. Farmers rise early with the sun. Shepherds guide their flocks across the grassy hillsides. Tradesmen work in small wooden workshops in towns and villages. Life moves at a steady and familiar rhythm. But in the early years of the 14th century, Scotland is not at peace. For nearly 2 decades, the country has been caught in a long struggle with its powerful neighbour to the south, England. English kings have tried to bring Scotland under their control. Armies have marched north across the border many times. Castles have been captured and recaptured, towns have been burned, and the lives of ordinary people have been shaped by years of uncertainty and war. Yet despite these hardships, resistance has never fully faded. Across Scotland, groups of fighters continue to oppose English rule. Some are noblemen with their own lands and followers. Others are ordinary soldiers who believe Scotland should remain its own kingdom. Among them is a man who will soon become one of the most famous figures in Scottish history, Robert the Bruce. Bruce has spent many years fighting to secure his claim to the Scottish throne. His path has not been easy. At times he has been forced to hide in remote parts of the country. At other times he has gathered small armies and fought against much larger English forces. Slowly, through patience and determination, he has begun to rebuild Scottish resistance. By the year 1314, Bruce has already achieved a number of important victories. Several key castles have returned to Scottish control. Confidence among his supporters has begun to grow. But the war is far from over. One stronghold remains especially important: Stirling Castle. This great fortress sits high above the River Forth. For centuries it has guarded one of the most important routes between northern and southern Scotland. Whoever controls Stirling Castle holds a powerful position in the land. In the spring of 1314, Scottish forces lay siege to the castle. The English garrison inside continues to hold out. But a promise has been made. If the castle is not relieved by an English army before midsummer, it will surrender to the Scots. This agreement sets the stage for what will soon become one of the most famous battles in Scottish history. An English army is already gathering in the south. Thousands of soldiers will march north towards Stirling. Their goal is simple: break the Scottish siege, defeat Robert the Bruce, and restore English control over Scotland. For now, however, the fields and woods around Stirling remain quiet. Morning mist settles gently over the land. The small stream known as the Bannockburn winds through the countryside. Birdsong drifts across the open fields, and few people yet realize that this peaceful landscape will soon become the setting for a moment that will echo through Scottish history for centuries to come. Among the many figures involved in Scotland's long struggle for independence, one name would come to stand above the others: Robert the Bruce. To later generations, he would become a legendary king. But in the years before the Battle of Bannockburn, his path had been uncertain and often difficult. Robert Bruce was born into one of the most powerful noble families in Scotland. His family owned lands both in Scotland and in England. Like many noblemen of the time, the Bruces lived in a world where loyalty, politics, and survival were often closely intertwined. The Scotland of Bruce's early life was not a peaceful kingdom. Disputes over the Scottish crown had already begun to divide the country. Several noble families believed they had rightful claims to rule. These disagreements opened the door for the powerful English king, Edward I, to intervene in Scottish affairs. Edward soon began asserting authority over Scotland itself. Castles across the country were occupied by English garrisons. Scottish nobles were expected to swear loyalty to the English crown. For many people in Scotland, the years that followed were filled with uncertainty. Robert the Bruce lived through these difficult times. At first, his loyalties, like those of many nobles, shifted as the political situation changed. But over time, Bruce came to believe that Scotland should be ruled by its own king. In the year 1306, Bruce took a bold and dangerous step. He had himself crowned King of Scots. The ceremony took place at Scone, the traditional site where Scottish kings were crowned. But this act did not bring immediate victory. Instead, it began some of the hardest years of Bruce's life. English armies moved quickly against him. Several of his closest supporters were captured. Some were executed. Bruce himself was forced to flee. For a time, he lived in hiding, moving through the remote landscapes of western Scotland. During those months, he relied on the loyalty of a small number of followers. They traveled quietly through forests and across rough hills, avoiding English patrols, waiting for an opportunity to rebuild their strength. Slowly, over the following years, Bruce began to regain ground. Instead of fighting large battles, he chose a different strategy. Small, fast-moving forces attacked English positions across Scotland. Castles were captured and then often destroyed, preventing them from being used again by enemy troops. Gradually, the balance of power began to shift. More Scottish nobles began to support Bruce. Villages and towns that had once feared English authority began to offer quiet assistance. By the early years of the 1400s, Robert the Bruce had firmly established himself as the leader of the Scottish resistance. Yet one major obstacle still remained: Stirling Castle. This great fortress continued to hold an English garrison, and as long as it remained in English hands, Scotland could not truly be secure. When Scottish forces finally surrounded the castle in 1314, a confrontation became unavoidable. An English army would soon march north, and Robert the Bruce would be waiting. By the summer of the year 1314, the long struggle for Scotland had reached an important moment. Stirling Castle remained one of the last major strongholds still held by English forces. The fortress stood high above the River Forth, its walls rising from a steep rocky hill. From its towers, soldiers could watch the surrounding countryside for many miles in every direction. For generations, the castle had guarded the main route between the northern and southern parts of Scotland. Anyone travelling through this region would eventually pass close to its walls. Because of this, the castle held great strategic importance. Whoever controlled Stirling Castle held a powerful position in the country. In the early months of 1314, Scottish forces moved to surround the fortress. They did not attempt to storm the walls directly. Instead, they placed the castle under siege. This meant cutting off supplies and waiting for the defenders inside to surrender. The siege was led by Edward Bruce, the brother of King Robert the Bruce. Edward Bruce was known as a determined and capable commander. His soldiers settled into positions around the castle, watching carefully for any sign of English reinforcements. Weeks passed. The defenders inside the castle knew their situation could not last forever. Food supplies were limited. Eventually, an agreement was made between the two sides. If the castle was not relieved by an English army before midsummer, it would surrender to the Scots. This agreement created a clear deadline, and word soon travelled south to England. When King Edward II heard of the siege, he knew he could not allow Stirling Castle to fall. If Scotland gained full control of the fortress, Robert the Bruce would become far stronger. So preparations began for a large English army to march north. Soldiers were gathered from across England and Wales. Knights prepared their armour and horses. Archers assembled with their longbows. Supplies were loaded onto carts for the long journey ahead. It would be one of the largest armies sent into Scotland in many years. Meanwhile, Robert the Bruce understood that this moment had been coming. If the English army reached Stirling Castle, a battle would likely follow. Bruce carefully studied the land south of the castle. The countryside here was crossed by small streams, patches of woodland, and areas of soft ground. One of these streams was known as the Bannockburn. It flowed quietly through the fields, not far from the castle itself. Bruce believed that this landscape could help his smaller army. If the Scottish forces chose their ground carefully, they might be able to slow the advance of the larger English army. So Scottish soldiers gathered in the countryside nearby. They prepared defensive positions, paths were blocked, and the land itself was studied with great care. All the while, the English army continued its long march northward. Across rivers and valleys they travelled, through towns and villages, until finally they reached the lands near Stirling. For now, however, the fields around Bannockburn remained quiet. The summer air moved gently across the grasses. Birds circled above the open ground, and the stream continued its slow journey through the landscape. But before long, thousands of soldiers would arrive here, and the peaceful countryside would become the setting for one of the most important battles in Scottish history. As the English army finally approached the lands near Stirling, the quiet countryside began to fill with movement. Thousands of soldiers travelled slowly across the fields and roads leading toward the castle. Armoured knights rode on powerful horses. Foot soldiers marched behind them in long lines. Archers carried bundles of arrows and tall longbows across their shoulders. It was a large and impressive force, much larger than the army Robert the Bruce had gathered. Yet Bruce had chosen his ground carefully. The Scottish army positioned itself in the countryside near the small stream known as the Bannockburn. Here the land was uneven and difficult in places. Patches of woodland and areas of soft ground limited the movement of large groups of cavalry. Bruce believed this would help protect his soldiers from the charge of heavily armoured knights. On the afternoon before the main battle began, both armies moved cautiously through the surrounding countryside. Scouts watched one another from a distance. Messengers rode between commanders carrying reports. Small groups of soldiers shifted their positions as the situation slowly unfolded. It was during this time that one of the most famous moments in Scottish history is said to have taken place. King Robert the Bruce was riding quietly along the Scottish lines. He wore simple armour and rode a small horse. Unlike many knights of the time, Bruce preferred to remain calm and mobile rather than surrounded by heavy protection. As he moved across the field, an English knight named Henry de Bohun noticed him in the distance. De Bohun was a skilled warrior and a relative of the powerful English Earl of Hereford. Seeing the Scottish king riding ahead of his army, he saw an opportunity. Lowering his lance, de Bohun urged his horse forward into a charge. Across the open ground he rode, his armour shining in the afternoon light. Those watching nearby would have seen the English knight racing toward the Scottish king at great speed. Bruce remained where he was. Rather than fleeing, he turned his horse to face the approaching rider. In his hand he carried a simple battle axe. As the English knight came closer, Bruce waited calmly. At the very last moment he guided his horse slightly to the side. The charging knight passed close beside him, and in a single swift movement, Bruce swung his axe. The blow struck de Bohun and brought him crashing from his horse. The encounter lasted only a moment, but the story quickly spread among the soldiers who witnessed it. Some said it showed Bruce's courage. Others remembered how calm he appeared even in the face of danger. Bruce himself is said to have looked down at his broken axe handle afterwards and quietly remarked that he had struck the blow a little too hard. Soon the moment passed. Both armies returned their attention to the larger struggle that lay ahead. The main battle had not yet begun, but it was now clear that neither side would withdraw. The fields near Bannockburn would soon decide the future of Scotland. As evening approached on the 23rd day of June in the year 1314, the English army continued to move slowly towards Stirling. Their goal was simple: reach the castle and break the Scottish siege. But the land south of Stirling did not offer an easy path. Streams crossed the countryside, wooded areas interrupted the open ground, and the Scottish army had carefully chosen positions that limited the movement of the English cavalry. Robert the Bruce organised his soldiers into tight formations known as schiltrons. These were groups of infantry soldiers standing close together with long spears pointing outward. When arranged correctly, these formations could form a strong defensive wall against charging horses. The Scottish soldiers trained carefully to hold these positions, standing shoulder to shoulder, spears angled forward, waiting for the advancing army. Across the fields, the English forces continued to gather. Knights in heavy armour formed ranks. Archers prepared their bows. Foot soldiers moved slowly across the uneven ground. From a distance, the scene may have appeared strangely quiet. Thousands of men stood waiting, watching one another across the open land. The summer air moved gently through the grasses. Clouds drifted slowly overhead. Yet everyone understood that a great battle was about to begin. As the English forces pushed forward, some of their cavalry attempted to move across the difficult ground toward the Scottish lines. But the narrow approaches and the soft ground near the streams slowed their advance. The Scottish schiltrons held their positions. Spears remained steady. When the cavalry came close, the wall of spears forced the horses to turn away or slow their charge. The day continued with cautious movements rather than a single sudden clash. Groups of soldiers advanced, then withdrew. Commanders studied the land and adjusted their plans. As the sun slowly moved toward the horizon, the first day of fighting came to an uneasy close. Neither side had achieved a decisive victory, but the Scottish army had successfully held its ground, and the English forces now faced a difficult problem. They had not reached Stirling Castle, and the land ahead remained controlled by Robert the Bruce and his soldiers. Night soon began to settle across the countryside. Fires were lit in both camps. Soldiers rested where they could. Some sharpened their weapons. Others spoke quietly with the men beside them. Above the darkening fields, the sky slowly filled with stars. The quiet countryside near the Bannockburn waited for what the next morning would bring. For on the following day, the battle would reach its decisive moment. Morning came slowly across the fields near the Bannockburn. A light mist rested over the ground as the first pale light of dawn spread across the countryside. Both armies stirred quietly as the new day began. Soldiers rose from where they had rested during the night. Campfires faded into thin trails of smoke drifting upward into the cool morning air. For many of the men gathered here, the coming hours would decide the future of the long struggle for Scotland. Robert the Bruce moved among his soldiers early that morning. He spoke calmly with his commanders and walked through the lines of men preparing for battle. The Scottish army gathered once again in their tight formations. Spears held ready, shields close together, each group standing firmly beside the next. Across the field, the English army prepared to advance. Their numbers were large, but the ground before them remained narrow and uneven. As the English soldiers began to move forward, the crowded space made it difficult for their forces to spread out. Horsemen, foot soldiers, and archers pressed together as they tried to advance toward the Scottish lines. Meanwhile, the Scottish formations slowly moved forward from their defensive positions. Step by step, they advanced across the ground. The long lines of spears created a moving wall that was difficult for the English cavalry to break. As the two armies drew closer, the pressure of so many soldiers in such a small space began to create confusion among the English ranks. Horses struggled to move. Orders were difficult to hear. Groups of soldiers became separated from one another. At the same time, the Scottish army continued to push forward together. Their formations remained tight, their movement steady. What began as a defensive position slowly became an advancing line. Across the field, the balance of the battle began to shift. More Scottish soldiers joined the advance, and the English army, crowded against the streams and soft ground behind them, found it increasingly difficult to organize a clear retreat. Gradually, the English forces began to fall back. Some soldiers moved toward the nearby river crossings. Others withdrew toward the open countryside. As the lines broke apart, the outcome of the battle became clear. The Scottish army had achieved a decisive victory. The English army retreated southward, and Stirling Castle soon surrendered to the Scots, as had been promised. The Battle of Bannockburn would become one of the most important victories in Scottish history. It strengthened Robert the Bruce's position as king, and it gave new confidence to those who believed Scotland should remain an independent kingdom. Today, the fields around Bannockburn are quiet once again. Grass grows where soldiers once stood. The small stream still winds through the land just as it did centuries ago. Visitors walking through the countryside may find it hard to imagine the thousands of men who once gathered here. Yet the story of those 2 summer days in 1314 remains one of the most remembered moments in the history of Scotland. And the quiet fields near Stirling continue to hold the memory of that distant battle.